disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
A boss ain't nothing but a thief on a time loan. 128-bit war, you play Nintendo. On some shooter, so put the bridge down. Don't feed us to the killer bees. We get what we deserve. Like bury me with my MP3s. Write my manifesto in 72 DPI. Life's just a game. You got cheated, never learned. I write these songs for every bridge that ain't been burned. For every cop car that ain't been
Welcome to This Is America, December 15th, 2021. On this episode, we cover resistance news, from clashes in the streets with police, strikes, and calls for mutual aid and disaster relief. We then switch gears and discuss inflation and the ongoing push by the GOP into open fascist politics. All this and more, but first, let's get to the news. Last month, people took the streets across the U.S. in response to the Rittenhouse verdict. In Portland, a riot was declared as people clashed with the police and broke windows in the downtown. In New York, anarchists and anti-fascists organized a night march in Queens, writing graffiti and clashing with the authorities. In San Diego, people took to the streets, and across the so-called U.S., anti-Rittenhouse graffiti hit the walls. In New York, people continued to take the streets to demand justice for Mike Rosado and freedom for his father, who currently is locked up in Rikers Island for trying to defend his son from killer cops. Abolitionist students at UC Davis marked the 10-year anniversary of police pepper spraying Occupy demonstrators by dropping banners, writing graffiti, and setting off smoke canisters in front of the campus police station. Anti-ICE protesters rallied outside the home of DHS Secretary and dropped off 115 boxes of Trump's ICE contracts, which the Biden administration promised to cancel. Instead, ICE has continued to keep them in place, turning local police into extension of ICE. Walkouts happened across the so-called U.S. as students at Little Elm High School in Texas staged a walkout in support of fellow students who were the victims of harassment and sexual assault. In response to the walkout, police responded with brutality, prompting further protests. Parents also pushed back against administration and police, with one parent stating at a meeting called in response to the police brutality, "You have demonized our kids, demonized the sexual assault victims, and allowed our children to be tased, manhandled, arrested, and jailed." In Iowa City, over 100 students participated in a protest and walkout last Friday, walking out of school as the final period began and meeting to discuss racism within the district and the failure of schools and the administration to address it. In San Francisco, hundreds of students walked out in protest of sexual assault, and students at Tigard High School in Oregon also held a walkout in response to a racist video being shared on social media by a student. Across the U.S., mass strikes continue. In Detroit, Wobblies mobilized to feed striking Kellogg's workers. According to other reports, strikes and boycotts of Kellogg's cereals are having a mass impact on the corporate giant. In Seattle, people held a rally in solidarity with Rojava. The Heater Block has produced a new DIY guide on how to make and distribute copper coil heat burners. You can check out our show notes for that PDF. And there is a renewed call for support for protest camps which are resisting the forced removal of native elders from the Miniwaka Indian colony in so-called Nevada. For ways to donate and a wish list of supplies, check out our show notes. And finally, in the wake of massive tornadoes that have left many dead across the so-called Midwest, mutual aid groups are calling for donations and supplies. Check out our show notes for ways to get involved and groups to donate to. And now for some upcoming events. On Monday, December 20th, there's a conversation with William C. Anderson around his new book, The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition. There's also another William C. Anderson event on Tuesday, December 21st, and both events are online. You can check out our show notes for ways to register. On December 31st, there's a call for New Year's Eve demonstrations happening outside of jails, prisons, and detention facilities across the world. On Saturday, January 8th, there's the Los Angeles Anarchist Book Fair. And finally, if you value It's Going Down as a revolutionary autonomous media resource and you want to see us continue and grow, if you want to support this project, please go to itsgoingdown.org/shop. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop. You can sign up to donate monthly, give us a one-time donation, or donate through Bitcoin. You can also subscribe to our podcast, listen to us on the radio, follow us on social media, tell a friend about us, and also, if you like this show, check out other anarchist podcasts on the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Again, support It's Going Down, support our work, help us continue to grow. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop. Thanks for listening. As always, enjoy the discussion, and we will see you soon.
Similar to how the sunshine on me, the truth will never let me sleep. Feeling like unless our eyes wide open, we will never know the way to set us free.
Waking up to the world and I feel right away that I wanna go back to sleep again. But ain't no time for that before my mind is at ease and my people can breathe again. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, say they names, rest in power. Ain't no justice, so no peace. Sound good to me. I didn't know how much I missed the music until you played that beat for me. And after that I couldn't put it back, couldn't switch it off. Sorta like the struggle, how we just can't let shit go. So they say that we obsessive, but it's them that can't listen. We tried every language to let them know. Shine on me, the truth will never let me sleep, no. Feeling like unless our eyes wide open, we will never know the way to set us free. Oh, good thing we got the key, bad thing it's underneath. White fear of not being at the center of history. I said, good thing we got the key, empathy, creativity, Black Lives Matter 2020 till infinity. More than just a phrase, more than just a face. People with ideas, dreams and hopes, we're more than just a face. More than just a race, it could never be erased. Despite white supremacists with riot gear and mace. Calling all white people, time to make a change. It's up to us to dismantle what was built in our name.
So you might have been talking recently with family about this over the holiday, but inflation is back on the menu in terms of discussion in the news media. And you might have also seen like stickers from the far right at gas pumps that have like photos of Biden like pointing at the price, being like, I did this. And there's also talk from like neoliberals, like for instance, if you listen to Marketplace on NPR, it's it's so tone deaf. It's the same stuff that we heard under Trump. The economy is doing so well. How can people be so destitute and strung out on their luck and unhappy? So let's kind of pull this apart. What is actually happening? What are the forces driving inflation? And what does that mean exactly?
Inflation is a really complicated idea in the 21st century. And we'll go into why as we kind of work through this. But before we get into the really complicated stuff, I want to talk about the two kind of superficial, really apparent, obvious causes of inflation. There is a supply shortage. I mean, there's no doubt about that. That's happened as a result of shifting employment dynamics. That's happened as a result of delays at ports and delays in shipping. That's happened as a result of the Postal Service having its sort of service and its service cut and its employee numbers cut, and having its sorting facilities shut down, at least some of them. So there is a logistics crisis. Now, that logistics crisis has nothing to do with government policy. Republicans want to blame the administration for the logistics crisis, when in reality, this is a result of the pandemic. Lots of people have left substandard jobs. They've been able to do so because we're getting subsidies from the federal government. And as a result, what that's meant is that the economy hasn't entirely imploded on itself, right? Because without these subsidies, just to be really, really clear, without this like $250 every other week or whatever we're getting, without these like big payouts that happened last year, without like the pause in student loan payments, without that, the economy would be essentially non-existent at this point.
Which is what
right?
those things are designed to do.
Yes.
It's designed to keep capitalism afloat, and we've talked about this over and over again. It's not to redistribute wealth or take money away from those on the top and give it back to people on the bottom. It's to give people enough money so they can continue to go to McDonald's and spend that $5 at Starbucks to keep the economy going. Because otherwise it shuts down. And we've talked about this before. You know, Republicans have thrown up their hands. It's like, oh, wow, we cut off all these programs and we stopped giving people money and all of a sudden the economy takes a dive. Well, yeah, because no one has any money, you idiot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a basic contradiction in capitalism, right? So, like, within capitalism, the goal, obviously, is to always drive production costs down and maximize surplus value when you sell things. And one of the easiest ways to do that in automation is to just lower the number of workers you have, right? To automate things more. We've seen this. Machines don't take breaks. Machines don't get injured, right? They just kind of keep moving. And if you can reduce the number of humans in a factory down, you end up with more efficient, more profitable, more consistent production. The problem is that if you do that enough, the entire economy crashes. Because at the end of the day, it's those workers' wages that keep the economy going. It's those workers' wages that buy food and housing and clothes for their kids, right? It's not that it magically just shows up. So if you cut production cost enough, you end up with an economy that doesn't function, right? Right now, if you were to cut consumer spending more, which would mean cutting off the subsidies, the economy would tank. If the subsidies had never happened, the economy would tank. But the flip side is, because the subsidies are happening, a lot of Americans can leave substandard work and are doing so. One of the outcomes of that has been this logistics crisis. So that is the thing that is happening. I would argue that that is an incredibly powerful indication of the power of the working class in the United States. That by sort of in a completely decentralized, uncoordinated way, deciding that the labor conditions that are prevalent are not sufficient enough for you, and then just refusing to take those jobs, is a form of labor withdrawal. And it's happening on a mass scale. And that's something to be really interested in, right? But it's had this inflationary effect. Things cost more money now because there's less of it. Supply and demand dynamics alone would indicate that price would go up in a situation like that. We also definitely have a situation in which certain companies are trying to recoup lost profits. We're definitely seeing this in the energy sector, for example, right? Talked about oil prices. Well, we talked about gasoline prices. Gasoline prices in the United States are tied to two things. The first is oil cost. How much does oil cost per barrel? Keep in mind, most oil produced in the United States is produced domestically, right? I think something like 70% of the oil and natural gas that we consume in the United States is produced domestically. Now, we purchase a lot of oil from overseas, but it all gets refined in the United States. And that has to do with the second cost influence in the price of gasoline, which is the cost of refining, right? So you buy the oil, you have to refine it and transport it to gas stations, right? All of that adds to the cost. So when you end up in a situation where trucking lines are dealing with delays and you can't get gasoline as fast, and in which people are cutting back on travel because we can't go anywhere because of the pandemic, and so people aren't leaving their houses and aren't going to work as much and so on. What's happening now is that oil companies could lower prices on gasoline and people would probably buy more gas, but they've done the calculus and it actually makes sense for them to raise gas prices. The price of oil hasn't been raised that much. It's stayed relatively stable. Yet the price of gasoline has gone up. Some of that can be attributed to these kind of supply chain delays. A lot of that is just recouping lost profits, though. And this is a really common thing in the energy sector to do. You've seen this in other industries, too. And you're seeing different industries play this out in different ways. Some of those things have to do with inflation. Some of them have to do with things like big, huge fire sales of stuff like you're seeing on Amazon and things like that right now.
I just find it fascinating when you talk to people, the idea I've heard this before from folks, just in talking about the economy, this idea essentially that like workers asking for more wages, it's their fault, as if people responding to the realities of the economy saying like, we cannot live on this amount, we're stretched too thin, we need more money. It's their fault. But somehow the capitalists who are in control of this, or the people that run the economy and the government that set all the prices and stuff, them acting in their class interest somehow, it's not their fault at all.
There's two things going on there that I want to dive into about the source of that argument. And the first is actually trickle-down economics, right? Both Democrats and Republicans, to varying degrees, embrace the idea of trickle-down economics. Now, what's really funny about trickle-down economics is that the entire model was literally drawn on the back of a cocktail napkin at a bar by some economist that is relatively discredited within academic economics. He was talking to a person from the Heritage Foundation and drew this diagram of a way that tax breaks could be justified before the Reagan administration. And that got adopted as policy. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. I mean, there's a lot of problems with this. First is, nothing in that model is real. Everything about trickle-down economics shows us that when you give the wealthy more money, they pocket it. And that's a clear reason why on Market Watch, they talk about how the economy is doing so well. Because on paper, every indicator, things are going perfectly fine. The stock market's going up, cryptocurrency prices are going up, it looks like people are making money, and nobody wants to think about the fact that 96% of the stock and assets are owned by 4% of the population in the United States.
We've talked about this multiple times on the show, and we talked about this like a couple years ago, but like this delusion that in neoliberal circles they constantly talk about, and this is akin to like trickle down almost, but the idea that like, if we give the people that are running the economy more money, then that's going to somehow equate to more jobs, more infrastructure, more investment, more taxes to, local governments so they can build schools and fix roads and train tracks and all that stuff. That's just a fallacy. Like you're saying, they're literally keeping it.
It's trickle-down economics has literally not worked once. Like, it does not matter what level of government you talk about it. It doesn't matter where in the world you talk about it. Literally. Not a single time has the process of giving the wealthy more money led to a better standard of living for people that weren't wealthy. It literally has never happened. Not once. So that's the first problem, is that it's a fiction. It's a fiction that doesn't work. And so there's this idea that, well, if poor folks start to ask for more, then what they're doing is they're really violating the tenets of trickle-down economics, and that's bad. The second problem with trickle-down economics, and this relates to this sort of objection that gets raised by conservatives a lot, they never are able to wage an argument about why trickle-down economics is a preferable economic policy to literally anything else, except that it gets rich people more money. Right? We saw with things like the New Deal that by subsidizing corporations through subsidizing consumption, the economy can stabilize and the standard of living can go up. Right? We've seen that. That is the opposite of trickle-down economics. What we have never seen is the inverse, right? Now, since the 1980s, we've lived in this increasingly financialized economy in which what's going on the stock market, what happens in real life are existing at these increasingly widening gaps from one another, to the point where today, nothing that happens on the stock market says almost anything about what happens on the ground, like almost at all. And most of us are not really all that impacted by what happens on Wall Street. Almost at all, except when it comes to things like credit markets.
I wanted to read something real quick. This is on World Socialist, and again, don't like the politics of the site. They do have some good analysis on economy and imperialism stuff. I just wanted to read from this article about how good corporations are doing right now and about inflation. Profit margins are at their highest level since 1950, during the early part of the post-World War II economic boom. Yeah. Nearly 2/3 of publicly traded U.S. corporations have reported higher profit margins this year compared to last year, 2020, 100 of the largest have booked profit margins at least 50% above last year's levels. Now here's us. Real average hourly earnings for all employees decreased 0.5% from September to October 2021. So this is like just a month ago or so. With inflation rising at the fastest pace since 1990, year over year, real wages fell 1.2% seasonally adjusted from October 2020 to October 2021. When combined with a 0.3% decrease in the average work week, there was a 1.6% fall in real weekly earnings. Now that's a bunch of mumbo jumbo. Basically what it says is that in terms of real wages, people actually lost. So even though there's been some adjustments, there's been, people getting $15 an hour at these new McDonald's jobs, that doesn't mean jack shit in the real final analysis when you factor in inflation, how bad things are, the rising in cost of everything, just everything people have been affected by the pandemic. So even though wages have gone up in some areas, despite that really doesn't matter because the overall economic picture is so bad for working people in terms of real wages, which have been stagnant, since the 1970s, since financialization and neoliberalism have become the rule of the day. Again, wages are essentially stagnant, in this case have basically gone down by this small amount when compared to the earnings of financial corporations, which have gone up exponentially. I mean, compared to 1950, when the U.S. became this global hegemonic power throughout the world, after World War II.
Yeah, and so then the question becomes, well, what else could be possibly driving inflation? I mean, we see these kind of two elements, right? We see in sectors where profits did not maximize during the pandemic, things like gasoline and stuff like that, prices are going up to recoup profits. There's this supply chain crisis that's happening. But there's this third element, and this relates to this argument that's getting waged by conservatives right now over things like raising the minimum wage. So the argument, as you said, is that, well, if you give poor people more, then that drives inflation up. Okay, so there is an argument to be made. It's not a good one, but there's an argument to be made for this. And essentially the argument is, well, if people have more money to spend and there's more money in circulation, then obviously that currency is worth less because there's more money in circulation and therefore prices go up. Okay. So the argument there is that when more currency is in circulation, that currency is worth less. All right. That used to be true before 1972. In 1972, the U.S. government floated the U.S. dollar and created it as a fiat currency. Prior to that, the U.S. government was on the gold standard. Not only the U.S. government, but the entire global economic system, through the Bretton Woods Agreement, was pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the U.S. dollar was pegged to the price of gold. And in that system, the amount of money, the amount of gold that was sitting at Fort Knox, every single dollar was a proportion of that gold. So if you had $1 trillion, each dollar was 1/trillionth of that entire portion of gold. So therefore, if you printed more money, that money was worth less. It's a really simple mathematical calculation, right? But there's one huge, massive problem with a gold standard-based economic system for capitalists. And that is that you can't expand it very quickly. Because every single time you loan somebody money, you're creating money, right? Every single time that someone buys something on a credit card, you've created money, at least temporarily, right? Every single time a check is written, every single time someone gets a mortgage, right? That all increases the supply of circulating currency. Therefore, to have a financialized system largely grounded in dynamic credit markets, like the one that we have now, if that were to exist under a gold standard system, inflation would be absolutely uncontrollable all the time, and the economy would crash immediately. So therefore, to grow the economy to these to grow the financial economy to these sort of ridiculous extents that we see today, it was necessary to float the currency, to decouple it from the gold standard, and in that process sort of end the Bretton Woods regime that had started after World War II. What happens now is that currency functions almost like any other product on a market in that it's a supply and demand calculus. And so to do business in the United States, you have to do that business in dollars. Okay? So if you're coming from Europe, you have to trade your euros for dollars. And that increases the demand for dollars and decreases the demand for euro. So you can use currency prices, comparative currency prices, to get a sense of what people think about the health of an economy. That if people feel that the economy is going to crash, if people think that there is too much debt being generated and we can't pay it back, if people think that, you know, there's another variant of a deadly virus that has just emerged, right? Something like that. They're a lot less likely to engage in speculative investment. And as that being the case, there's a lot less currency exchange that goes on. That drops demand for currency globally, which then lowers the price of the dollar. Now, for things produced domestically from materials that were produced domestically, that's not a huge issue. But at the point in which you're buying materials overseas or buying products overseas, which much of the U.S. economy is based on, the U.S. dollar falling in relation to, say, the Chinese yuan, is a big problem. Because now, every product that people want to buy in the U.S. costs more money, because it costs more money to purchase for the person selling it. And so, we're in this situation now, in which we are watching two completely different realities play themselves out. We're watching this one reality, which is the reality that gets covered on television, which is the one that we're taught to care about, which involves things like, you know, monetary supply and stock prices and stock index prices and things like this. We're all taught to care about that. We're all taught that that is what the economy is. And in that world, it looks like everything is going super well. Even if there's mild inflation, it looks like everything's going super well. They're making a lot of money on that inflation. You know, everything looks sunny from there. But then you get down onto the streets of America. And what's happening, at least in my world, living where I live, is I'm seeing a lot of desperation. You know, we've watched violent crime go up in the United States. A lot of that violent crime is tied to economic desperation. A lot of drug dealing and drug trafficking is tied to desperation. A lot of robbery is tied to desperation. Those are the types of crimes going up the most.
Well, what's the one thing we've seen on the news lately that's been, like, in terms of crime?
The roaming looters.
The roaming looters, you know, the smash and grab, you know, they're boarding up the windows in all these expensive stores.
Yeah. For those of you that don't know, what's happening all over the U.S., and it's happening multiple times a day now, is a whole crew of people of, like, 60, 70 people just roll up on a store, smash the windows, and steal as much as they can and run. It's kind of awesome, and, like, big ups to anyone that's getting away with that stuff, but, like, that is obviously a sign of desperation.
Yeah, well, it's people making a calculus being like, well, do we want to possibly risk going to jail, you know, selling narcotics or stealing cars? Or do, like, 10 of us want to get together and, like, you know, roll over some iPads and then sell them on the black market?
Mm-hmm. Or a Louis Vuitton store was one of the things.
A Louis Vuitton store, which I'm sure, like, by the time you break it up between however many people in the group, like, they're not making that much money. But, of course, then again, people selling drugs in a large criminal enterprise usually aren't either. There's actually a really fascinating book called Gang Leader for a Day. And it's about the projects outside of Harvard, and this sociology student goes and, like, befriends this gang leader. I think it's like Gangster Disciples or something like that. And it's sort of like his analysis of just, like, how the gang works and the money that it brings in. One of the things that he does is he breaks down basically the wages that low-level people selling narcotics in these housing projects make, and he says it's like, look, this is like minimum wage out here.
Yeah.
And because there's no jobs available, and this is basically what's available. But when you break down the amount of time that people spend getting locked up or, like, not working, or the money they do bring in, even though it's kind of in these large amounts in different spurts, we're talking about essentially minimum wage.
Yeah. And so when we're looking at something like inflation in this context, it's really important. Right? Because it's not that, you know, this money has been created. It's not what the Republicans are arguing, which is that because of these subsidy programs we have inflation. That's not accurate. That would be accurate in a world of the gold standard, but that's not how anything works anymore, and I would imagine at least some of those people know that. What it is demonstrating, though, is that beyond all the glitz and the glamour and the news coverage of the wonderful stock market and blah, 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 underlying that is nothing. There's nothing there. The American economy is, for all intents and purposes, being prevented from crashing purely because of government subsidy. That's the reality that we live in. And we've mentioned this on this show before, but the problem that emerges at that point is at some point, and this is happening globally now, governments have to make a choice. And they can choose to continue to subsidize their economies and potentially go into debt default, or at least have their credit ratings downgraded, and potentially end up in long-term unsustainable debt. Or they could cut the subsidies and allow their economies to crash. Either way, the outcome is not good, right? Either way, we're looking at a situation of suffering. We're looking at a situation of deprivation. And other people around the world that would otherwise be buying stuff in the United States or investing in the United States see that as well. That's why inflation is going up. There's way less demand for US dollars than there was. There's a lot more demand for foreign currency that there was, because remember, the price of the dollar doesn't fall on its own. It only falls in relation to other currencies, right? And so, very obviously, if it's falling, that means that other currencies are getting more valuable. And that is an indication of a lack of confidence in the future of the American economy. For those of us on the ground, we see it everywhere, right? Our friends are out of work. Most of our neighbors are out of work. There's like violent crime everywhere. People are really desperate. We all know this, right? And that's also what people around the world are seeing. Now, the problem becomes, right now, what we're faced with is we're faced with a reality in which, if we continue to perpetuate the existence of capitalism, we are walking ourselves off of a cliff. There is no way away from that. Just logically, mathematically. There's no way out from that. Might not happen tomorrow. Might not happen in a month or a year. But the fact of the matter is that capitalism has been slowly collapsing pretty much since 1973. Very slowly. It's been held up by things like tax breaks. It's been held up by ideas of trickle-down economics. It's been held up by government subsidy programs and financialization and the creation of massive, massive amounts of consumer debt. That has propped the economy up. But in 2008, that reality vanished. That wasn't enough to prop it up anymore on its own. And that reality vanished. The thing is that all we have left now is that reality. What we have left is we have a reality in which the image, in which the presentation, the spectacle of the economy, has come to substitute in people's minds for their actual experience. That they are experiencing suffering and deprivation. Yet they're being told that everything is fine and great. And we all know it's not. And so, at some point, we say this a lot on this show, and we do, because there are a lot of these inflection points. But at some point, a choice is going to get made. By us. Not by the people in power, not by the people who run the economy, but by us. And a lot of American workers are making that decision right now. Which is that they're not going to participate anymore. They're just not. They're just opting out of wage labor, at least for the time being. And that is part and parcel of a wider, increasingly wide social rejection of capitalist economics. What we saw last year was we saw an uprising that was largely, at least in part, caused by economic dynamics that are fundamentally tied to racism, to deprivation, to over-policing of poor neighborhoods, to, racism, to things like this, right? To the history of colonialism in the United States, which colonialism is an economic system, right? We saw that spectacle crash completely for whole generations of Americans last year. What we have to do is we have to manifest that crash. Otherwise, we're stuck in a position where we're going to walk ourselves off a cliff.
lots of Trump news happening. We're going to dive in and talk about all of the different aspects of the lawsuits, the J6 investigation. As we speak today, Ali Alexander was served with 2 civil lawsuits. There's just like a lot of news in the air. There's a lot of spicy rhetoric per se today. One of the trending headlines was that Matt Gaetz went on Steve Bannon's show talking about how they needed like shock troops to take over the government and stuff. And
Yeah.
And also there's a lot of beef that's happening right now in MAGA world. Like Lynn Wood has just declared war on everyone. Former General Michael Flynn has like got recorded on tape saying that QAnon is a scam, which who would have seen that one coming?
A CIA disinformation operation was the thing he said very specifically.
Right, and this is also a guy that like got his whole family in front of like some barbecue on 4th of July or something to like do the QAnon oath. I mean, I don't know the political like how do you get to, hey everybody, we know it's a scam, but this is, what the idiots want. So like, it's so bizarre.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot going on with Flynn. And we'll dive into this in a lot more detail, I think, but there's a clear sense that it's becoming very obvious that Michael Flynn is just scamming people.
Yeah.
He really doesn't have much of a way to make money, and he is making bank on these speaker fees at all these QAnon conferences, and so he's just kind of rolling with it, it feels like. But we can get into that in a lot more detail in a little bit.
So let's kind of start off in this direction, this aspect of all these different beefs and people fighting with each other and like people sniping through social media. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, are very well known for this, not only like with other people in MAGA world, but also with political enemies within the Republican Party. I guess, what does it mean that these people are beefing with each other? I think this also kind of gets at the larger question that's always existed. Like, does Trumpism have a shelf life beyond Trump? And like, does this signal that kind of like things are unraveling in that world, or simply people are just like figuring out a pecking order more so? Because it seems like one of the ideas that we've been toying around is that Trump will basically fall into his role as sort of the kingmaker, and that he will be, kind of touted out sort of like Obama is within, liberal circles, as sort of somebody that like, gets everybody else to kiss the ring, and he, gets the crowds to get excited about some like milquetoast, like quasi-fascist populists that have policies that really don't challenge or threaten corporate elites, and that basically he will continue to exist in that role and not really change. And all these other people will sort of exist in a constellation around him and continue to make money and grift off of folks. But does this signal that sort of relationship is in trouble, or does it signal that maybe we got some of that analysis wrong?
To start, it makes sense to kind of talk about the factions that are at play here. So I think one of the bigger questions that we've been talking about is sort of MAGA world able to concretize or actually formalize some sort of real coalition? And back last year, if we want to think about when we started really talking about this question, the situation was really different than it is today. So last year, the lines of power were really clear in MAGA world, right? There were people that were in government and they were making decisions. And then the job of everyone outside of that was to kind of cheerlead and propagandize and boost and try and make sure that those people were able to stay in office, right? Then after the election, there was a lot of money to be made. And a lot of these people, Lynn Wood, Sidney Powell, Michael Flynn, a number of politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, so on, made a play to kind of make their names outside of whatever small bubble they were sort of operating in. And they started making these plays as a way to start to jockey for position. Because once they were out of power, all of a sudden the stakes changed. And so now the stakes are no longer who gets to be the most visible cheerleader for Trumpism, but the stakes are now who gets to continue to make money off this world, who gets to continue to rise in the political ranks off of this world, and who gets to take on the mantle of MAGA world after Trump leaves the stage, right? These are all really huge questions with really massive, massive implications. And so though all of these people can move in a similar direction last fall, or at least most of them were moving in a similar direction last fall, Now everything's falling apart. And so what we're seeing is a number of very distinct factions kind of emerge. First, you have this just implosion of QAnon, right? And it's kind of spreading out into all of these other conspiracy-informed sort of factions within the conservative movement, right? You've got Negative 48 faction, which is the JFK Jr. people, right? There's a whole group of QAnon people grouped around the idea that dead people aren't really dead.
Did you see that video where they were marching around in like 20 like women in their early 50s, like talking about JFK? It was shockingly bizarre.
What is disturbing about that movement very specifically, though, is that it's morphing itself into a death cult. For those of you that aren't paying attention, people are still in Dallas. They've been there crammed in hotel rooms and Airbnbs for over a month now, and they're all centered around this guy. I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, but his online handle is Negative 48. And he's this sort of numerology guy. He practices something called gematria, which is like a numerology system, but he does it in this really weird, like, simplistic way. And so he always constantly sits there and says, well, you know, the word evil, if you add up all the numbers of all the letters, equals 48. So I'm negative evil. So I'm negative 48, you know, and it's all stuff like this. They'll like sit over his dinner and like do the math on all the stuff on his plate. It's really weird, right? But for some reason, there's a whole faction of QAnon world that's really into stuff like this. And it's not just him. There's about 5 or 6 other really big influencers that do really similar things. There's a guy named Tommy Numbers that does stuff. But what's happening with this group is they've decided that, very much like Jehovah's Witnesses when they failed to predict the end of the world, that really the thing that they predicted did happen. But we can't see it. Like JFK Jr. did come back, but we just can't see it because he's invisible. And so we have to get on the same plane as him. And then, of course, to get on the same plane, you have to die. And so they're live streaming pretty much nonstop over Telegram right now. They have been for weeks. And all of these people are talking about how they haven't slept in 3 days, which is a pretty common cult brainwashing tactic. They've been taking weird gummies that they don't know what's in them, but it makes them feel real peppy. They've been smoking a lot of weed, right? Like they're doing stuff like this, which is all really common sort of like love bombing tactics and sort of like exhaustion tactics and things that are really, really, really common in cult programming, right? And so there's a whole faction of QAnon which is going full blown cult right now. And it's not unsizable. We're talking thousands and thousands of people are going full blown cult right now. There's another faction of QAnon, which is now coalesced around Lynn Wood and this idea that everybody outside of QAnon is a government plant, and therefore QAnon needs to consolidate and operate as its own political movement, right? And this is kind of the Lynn Wood push. Now, of course, he wants to be at the head of that movement, right? Because there's a lot of money to be made. There's a sort of like Michael Flynn, Sidney Powell faction that's building up, which is really kind of the traditional QAnon faction, right? Like that's what's still kind of left from traditional QAnon and kind of like the Stop the Steal stuff within that world. So that's happening. Outside of that now, you have a number of other conflicts that are starting to occur. You have this separation that has been drawn at this point between, say, people like Mitch McConnell and the right wing, where people like McConnell are increasingly starting to say, like, yeah, I mean, we know we lost the election and everything, you know, and they're starting to back away from all of the things that have happened in the last 6 months. It was really, or last year, it was really a question of how long that was going to take. But we finally hit this point. And I think for them, this is all about trying to broaden their base for the midterms. Because right now, if they go into the midterms like this, the Republicans still very much could lose the House, or continue to be the minority in the House, and not regain control of the House like they're sort of banking on, essentially.
Hold on a second. So you're saying that if they continue as they are now, which is sort of just like cringy, like conspiracy,
talking to themselves in really cringy ways, yeah.
Right. That they're going to lose because a lot of the rhetoric coming out of neoliberal circles is that, Biden is tanking, no one's interested, Trump is going to win.
Because, of course, in neoliberal circles, they want to believe that Biden was ever popular, right? Like, this is kind of the mythology of that whole narrative and sort of the lie that is a part of it, right? Or at least the inaccuracy that's a part of it. When we go into midterm elections traditionally, the opposition party tends to gain seats. And that tends to happen because there is a drop in support for the person who got elected. It happens almost every time, right? There's a long, long, long history of this. All of that, though, is premised on the assumption that a person got elected because people voted for them. And in most elections, that's true. And in this last one, it wasn't. Very few people voted for Joe Biden. Very many people voted against Donald Trump. There's a big difference there. So when we're in a position where people are voting to oppose something rather than voting to affirm something, it doesn't really matter so much whether the thing that got affirmed incidentally is successful or not. Because the opposite, the other side, right, the thing you voted against, is still so bad that it does not matter how bad the person that's in office is screwing up, they're not going to throw you in a prison camp. Right? And that's like literally how people think and talk about Trumpism now. The farther and farther and farther they drift into conspiracy theories and right-wing authoritarianism and things like that, the more and more and more they lose that sort of bank of voters that live in suburbs that are often the thing that swing an election one way or the other in a lot of parts of the country. And so they can't keep pushing that way. That's the argument that McConnell and that faction, Mitt Romney, people like that are starting to make. And as a result of that, they're not coming out and saying, oh, all these people lied, they're grifters, blah, blah, blah. They're doing the sort of, we're going to quietly move on and just hope that nobody notices thing, right? Which is really common amongst politicians. Just change the conversation, right? And that's really what they're trying to do. Then you have the other side of that, which is Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Paul Gosar, Louis Gohmert, Lauren Boebert, blah, 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 who are the people that are trying to, as hard as possible, affirm January 6th as a legitimate thing, but within the electoral system. This is a group of people that's trying to cut this really weird line here, where they're trying to say elections are illegitimate and stolen by Democrats all the time, but you still need to vote. And it's an incoherent argument. And I think it's really obvious to a lot of people that it's an incoherent argument. They're trying to still maintain this connection to the far right. They're trying to maintain this connection to conspiracy theorists. And they're raising a lot of money doing this. Like after this whole situation with Lauren Boebert saying a bunch of really horrendously Islamophobic stuff about Ilhan Omar a few weeks ago, she has raised a ton of money. And so people like this make their money off being controversial, right? And they're trying to claim the mantle of being MAGA, right? Like they're trying to be the most MAGA people, and they're trying to claim that mantle and are. Like they're the ones that are kind of carrying forward that narrative. You have another faction of Republicans now, which are splitting from that. And this is kind of expressed by Dan Crenshaw. So if y'all don't know who Dan Crenshaw is, he's the former Navy SEAL with the eye patch. He's a House rep from Texas. Traditionally has been associated with people like Paul Gosar, right? And sort of early on in his term, really, really pushed heavy in that direction. But he's been giving speeches recently where he's been backing down from that. And he's been starting to say Marjorie Taylor Greene and all these people, they're grifters. They're just using publicity as a way to raise money, as a way to build their own name recognition, as a way to gain better political office. This is all just about them, and no one should ever trust them. And he's going, okay, but no one should trust McConnell either, because he's a reformist, he's a liberal. You can't trust him. So Dan Crenshaw is trying to construct what he calls a youth movement, right? And he's used that term, youth movement, mostly out of students from like TPUSA and groups like that, where he's trying to maintain this kind of hard right conservatism without it falling into neo-Nazis, conspiracy theorists, blah, 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 right? He's trying to have MAGA world without all the problems of MAGA world. And he's trying to position himself for the next 8 years to be that person, to carry that forward. At the same time, you now have another group of people trying to do the same thing, which are all centered around Steve Bannon. Now, Steve Bannon, we'll get into this in a lot more detail later, so I'll just touch on it briefly. Steve Bannon recently came out and has been very critical of some of the people that Donald Trump has endorsed. And he's been saying they're not conservative enough, they're not down for the cause enough, they're not willing to invalidate the election, blah, blah, blah. Now, what's funny is he's saying these things about David Perdue, who, if you all remember, David Perdue was one of the Senate candidates in Georgia that was up on stages all last fall yelling about how the election was stolen, right? So this is a guy who did put his entire political career into the Stop the Steal thing and lost. And Bannon is claiming that he's not loyal enough. Now, what's interesting about that is he's claiming that this guy is not loyal enough while criticizing the figurehead of the thing that he's supposed to be loyal to. So why, right? Like, what's going on there? And I think with Steve Bannon, there's a lot happening. Again, we'll get into this whole, like, invading the administrative state thing later. But right now, suffice to say, what's happening with Bannon is the one person, really, within this constellation who's looking forward and saying, this is the thing that happens after Trump. And he is trying to concretize this kind of hyper-authoritarian, fascist faction to take over the mantle of MAGA world. Right? This is what he's saying. He's like, all of these things that Trump did that you liked, this is all the stuff that we want to do too, and we're going to be able to, like, finish the project of saving America, blah, blah, blah. And in reality, what they're doing is they're engaging in this relatively sophisticated, relatively well-funded, relatively well-organized attempt at flooding the state with loyalists and using those loyalists and using their position to take control of the state. You know, so all of this is happening all at once, right? We'll get a lot more into the whole, like, what are the implications of what Steve Bannon is trying to do at the end today. But for now, what's important, I think, to keep in mind is all of these little tiny nuances that existed that we've all been talking about for the better part of a few years, they're all starting to become fissures. And it hasn't led to everything falling apart yet, but it's starting to get there. Again, it's really important to keep in mind that those things could exist as nuanced separations when there were no stakes. Right? When the stakes were, let's keep this other guy in power. But now the stakes are, I want power. I want to make money in the process of gaining power. I want name recognition. I want this. I want that. And just like any business that has created competition, when you combine that competition with politics and the type of people that we're talking about, you get exactly what we're looking at right now. It's internal right-wing civil war. It hasn't really broken out fully yet. It's kind of confined mostly to figureheads. But that's only really a matter of time at this point, I think. We are going to watch some factionalization happen, and it's going to be really noticeable as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think also, especially too, I mean, be on the lookout for some interesting stuff to drop, because generally when these people fight with each other, they give up the dirt. You know, like, it's always interesting to watch. Yeah. To watch kind of like the alt-light Proud Boy types fight each other, because generally what they do is they're like, well, if you want to know who's really a Nazi, like Billy Bob over here, you know, here's a shrine to Adolf Hitler where he goes to sleep, and like, here's a photo. You know, they really drop the dirt.
Oh yeah, they do.
Like when
Lynn Wood's been pouring gasoline everywhere and lighting it on fire. It's so entertaining to watch.
Like when Augustus Invictus and a Base Stickman fought each other. I mean, that was fantastic, because they were just like, no,
so good.
He's really a white nationalist. No, he's really.
And they kept posting screenshots and evidence and stuff. It's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these people will tear each other to the ground. I mean, it's one of these things that those of us who have been doing anti-fascist work for a long time, I think all know. When the right wing fights each other, it's vicious. It's really vicious. Like, these people are terrible to each other. Terrible to each other. Like, we think that they're terrible to people outside of that political circle. And they are, right? Like, the right wing made the internet largely unusable for about a year and a half. Because of the death threats and the trolling and the blah, 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 right? But when they fight each other, it's way, way more vicious. And that's because when they're fighting people outside of their political scene, again, there's not really any stakes. Like, what are they doing? They're sitting there throwing crap against the wall, hoping that for some reason they get someone to stop talking to them so they can claim that they, quote, own the libs or something, right? And then they build publicity off that. But in reality, it doesn't matter how many times they lose an argument. It doesn't matter how many times they say something that isn't true. It literally doesn't matter, because the only clip anyone sees is the time that didn't happen. And so when they're fighting each other, though, everybody sees everything, because it's all happening in the venues that these people talk and organize in. And so everybody sees everything. And so the stakes get really high and everything gets really vicious, and people go after each other personally. this fight with Lynn Wood and literally everybody else has become really productive for us, right? Like, people should be listening to these phone call tapes because they talk about who's funding what. They talk about where money is going. They talk about who's on the board of what organizations and who's working with who and who talks to who and who doesn't actually work together, even though they're on stages together a lot. And I mean, you can map out the entirety of the QAnon section of this just by listening to these tapes. They're incredibly important for people to be paying attention to, especially because Lynn Wood is feuding with Kyle Rittenhouse, for example, right? That's what kind of actually kickstarted this whole thing. Is that he's feuding with Kyle Rittenhouse over trying to get Kyle Rittenhouse's bail money. Because in theory, the Fight Back Foundation, which Lynn Wood runs, technically bailed Kyle Rittenhouse out of jail. And before the verdict even came in, they had already filed a motion for the bail money. Right? That's a pretty clear indication that Lynn Wood's trying to make $2 million off of the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. And that's really shady. And so what's happening in this process is all these people are calling each other out for being really shady. And that's not just confined to QAnon world. That's escaping QAnon world at this point. People are calling each other out for being really shady and dropping all kinds of dirt on each other. And so we're watching that happen in the context of this factionalization, but we are also watching that have implications on the January 6th Commission hearings as well, where people are starting to turn on each other, and starting to give information, right? We talked a little bit about this last week, but that has just accelerated ever since then.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's turn now and talk about these lawsuits. Trump is being sued by some of the Capitol Police. Today, Ali Alexander was deposed for 8 hours. And he was also hit with 2 civil suits. So I think a big question is, like, what will come out of this? Will people get in legal trouble? Will it be kind of like Unite the Right? Will they walk away with, maybe some fines and like a, bruised image? For sure, probably a bunch of interesting stuff is going to come out. But what do they stand to lose in all this?
Yeah, so it's a really big question, because nothing like this has ever really happened before. There have definitely been civil suits that have resulted from political actions, right? But generally, those happen in contexts where we're not talking about a coup attempt by a sitting president, right? Because it's never happened before. The scale of this is so much bigger than any of these other situations where something similar may have happened. And so the people that are players in this are really nervous right now. We talked a little bit about last week how some of those people, like, I forget her name, who's the head of Women for America First, which was one of the co-sponsoring organizations, and a number of other, like, I think it was Tea Party Express was one of the co-sponsoring organizations. They've turned and they've given financial documents and hours and hours and hours of testimony, phone records, text messages, emails, everything to the January 6th Commission. And that is exposing a lot of funding lines. The other thing that's happening is that Trump just lost a lawsuit that he filed to prevent the release of White House documents related to January 6th. That finding came down today, meaning that the White House is now able to give the January 6th Commission every single document that they can find pertaining to the planning of January 6th or the attempt to invalidate the election, which, given the Trump administration's former practices around things, could involve all manner of things. They carried out government business on their phones, which makes their phones public record. They did it off their private email accounts, which makes all their emails public record, so on. Like, they made a lot of really dumb mistakes that expose a lot of information that otherwise would not have been. And a lot of that information is probably going to be really damaging because it's going to be coming from places where these people thought that they had some level of safety and levity to be able to speak frankly, when very much that was not true. This is also where we're starting to hear the stories about, like, Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene's staff promising pardons and things like that, right? So one of the side effects of this, though, is that people are starting to be able to trace the money and be able to trace the organizing circles. And so there's a couple of revelations that have come out of this. The first is the White House was absolutely 1,000% involved and very involved. They were involved on the day of. They were involved before that. They were organizing conference calls. They were organizing strategy with organizers on the ground. Like, they were a fundamental motivating factor within making that happen the way it happened. You've got people like Ali Alexander, who, as he put it, probably accurately, he doesn't have enough money to hire a lawyer, so he's just going to go testify now. And did for 8 hours. We don't know what he said yet, but if he was there for 8 hours, he said something. Definitely said more than just something if he was in there for 8 hours. There's also all of these other sort of organizers that were involved and the funders for them. So one of the things that we have figured out just in the last week is that the heiress to the Publix grocery store fortune, who I'm blanking on her name now, was the source of about 2/3 of all of the money that was used on January 6th to throw that event. And that money got funneled to the organizers through Alex Jones. And so now they're exposed. Because what's happening is that these civil suits are starting to target anybody that was a core player in January 6th. Obviously, Trump is getting sued by Capitol Hill police, okay? You've got Ali Alexander getting sued by, we're not sure who, but we know it pertains to January 6th. There's also the possibility of many other lawsuits. And so the tempo, what it feels like is happening at the moment is that the January 6th Commission is playing itself out. The January 6th criminal trials are playing themselves out. As we start to get to the end of that, as we get to the end of the criminal trials, and we start to have the really serious charges, the things that are pertaining to conspiracy primarily, almost every one of those people is going to get sued. And they're going to get sued for the same reasons that the organizers of Unite the Right got sued. They posed a public threat. And they did that on purpose as a way to intimidate people. And that is, something you get sued for a lot. Now, what happens in lawsuits, though? And I think that this is kind of one of these things that we don't, again, have a ton of precedent for, and so are kind of feeling out as we go. And this wasn't what necessarily happened at the Unite the Right trial. But what's a lot more likely to happen here, and this is because, unlike Unite the Right, the people that were involved in January 6th planning, politics is their whole career. That is where they make all their money. That is how they have all their influence. Everything. They don't have a life outside of this. And for most of these people, they've been building that career for 20-something years. And they can't just lose all of that. Someone like Chris Cantwell, it doesn't really matter whether you fine Chris Cantwell like $6 or $7 million or however much he got fined, because he's not going to pay it, and he can't. But someone like a chairperson like Stuart Rhodes, right? A chairperson who runs the Oath Keepers, for example. The Oath Keepers have money. That is an organization that can get sued. Women for America First raised millions of dollars last year. They've got money. Stop the Steal, which was run by Ali Alexander, raised millions of dollars, so they have money. And there's a lot of stakes. And so it happens in situations where there's a lot of stakes and people have this possibility of losing everything that they've worked their whole lives for. They turn on each other. And what happens in a civil context is that, usually civil settlements involve money, right? And in this case, they would as well. But they're very likely also to involve some level of debrief, especially if a lot of these organizers get sued together. So say someone, and it could be probably anybody in the United States, given the scale and scope of what happened, almost anyone could file this lawsuit. Because they tried to disenfranchise everybody. And so anyone that's a registered voter, in theory, could file this lawsuit. But essentially, if you sued all of these organizers at once, like what happened with Unite the Right, and what is likely to happen in this context as well, at least in some of these lawsuits, what is likely to happen is that the people that have more to lose, by not cooperating, will settle. And as part of that settlement, will give information to the plaintiffs' attorneys about what happened. And they will get debriefed by the plaintiffs' attorneys, and that information will get used in court, which then finishes that lawsuit and builds the foundation for another one. And so this could be going on for quite a while. It's really a big question of what jurisdictions they can get sued in, which could be pretty much almost anywhere. who falls within that group of people, which could be pretty much anyone that was there, right? Like there's a huge surface for lawsuits here. For a lot of these people, you know, like the heirs to the public's fortune, yeah, they'll get sued for a couple $1 million and lose. And that doesn't mean anything to them because they're worth like, I think $8 billion or something like that. But for someone who runs Women for America First, yeah, I mean, you're getting paid a solid salary. Sure. You have a lot of influence. You can raise a lot of money, but you cannot shoulder the burden of a $1 or $2 million legal settlement. Like you just don't have that kind of cash. And you definitely can't lose your whole career around that. And so as, again, just like with these feuds that are building up, as the stakes rise, right, as people have more to lose, as there is more at risk and more of a possibility of consequences, so as this thing plays itself out more and more and more, we're very likely to see two things happen concurrently. One is we're likely to see an increase in lawsuits, right? Where again, a lot of people are sort of waiting to see how things play out, waiting to get information about stuff before suing people. But we're already starting to see lawsuits flow in. So that's definitely going to be a thing. And we are very likely to see people increasingly cooperate. Now, what happens at that point? Because there's a lot of questions around not just money, but organizing networks. And so you take someone like Alex Jones, okay, who isn't a traditional Republican operative, like at all. And for many years refused to identify as a Republican, like always identified as a libertarian, like refused to identify as a Republican. Now he is essentially the person who laundered money to the organizers of January 6th from a billionaire.
Not only that, but I mean, Tucker Carlson recently did a segment on him basically saying like, you know, he tells the truth more than essentially, you know, the liberal press, basically.
Yeah.
Putting his arm around him. Which, I mean, I think there's a reason for that because he knows what's coming down the pipe.
Exactly. And so we're likely to see not only these people turn on each other, but we're likely to see this exacerbate these other divisions that we were talking about earlier. When people start getting sued, I mean, this was really the breaking point between Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell, for example, was the Smartmatic and Dominion Voting Systems lawsuits, right? It's one thing to sit there and say whatever crap comes to your mind on television. Anyone can do that, right? Anyone can just grift random people on the TV, right? Or on the internet. It's not hard. There's plenty of people that are, you know, will give money to things that they think are legitimate, even if they're not. But when all of a sudden it's about your law license and your financial future, well, there's some stakes there all of a sudden. And this whole fight within QAnon world, for example, started with Lynn Wood saying, hey man, I know my name's on those lawsuits and all that stuff that Sidney Powell filed, but I didn't look at any of those documents. She just signed my name on them, which obviously isn't true. But he's saying that so he doesn't lose his law license and get sued, right? That's a self-preservation move. And we're about to see a lot more of that. So again, you know, like anyone that's been around like anti-fascist circles for a long time or around like circles that counter right-wing political action, we've all seen this happen before. When the house of cards starts to fall down, all the rats rush for the exit all at the same time.
I think the other interesting thing is that what we'll start to see is interesting folks emerge that have like real money. Like, you know, like look at the folks that are behind Bannon. Like we've talked about this documentary many times, but it's called The Brink. He's like sitting down with Paul Gosar, you know, white nationalists from the Swedish Democrats, and then there'll be some dude that's from Goldman Sachs.
Yep.
Or some other big financial institution. So it's, I mean, these are the people that are basically giving him money. I mean, we also know about the Mercers, who I think have cut ties with him at this point. I mean,
they've cut ties with him, yeah.
You know, and here's another interesting thing too. We haven't brought this up. There's an interesting clip that we have. Actually, It's Going Down does. You can actually look it up on Twitter. But Richard Spencer was talking about meeting Bannon a couple times. And he was going on, he's like, you know, interesting thing about Bannon is like he'll go to anybody for money. You know, he'll go to the Mercers. And then he says he'll even go to Epstein.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but I mean, I say this because, I mean, they know where they can go to get a bunch of money. So I
Yes.
think that's going to be really interesting to see, like, where does this money trail lead us?
I think the other thing that we're starting to catch a glimpse at is a part of America that felt like a relic of the past, essentially. You know, like we had this wealthy class in the early 20th century that was sort of comically right wing, right? Rockefeller, Carnegie, so on, just like comically right wing, like absurdly, obscenely right wing, to the point where they're, you know, essentially jokes of themselves, right? It really felt like satire to read it in retrospect. And it felt for a while like some of that world was gone, right? That people who are billionaires now a lot of them are generally kind of pretty liberal because they made their money in tech, or they're people like Peter Thiel, who is just a comic book supervillain, or they're people like Elon Musk, who is just Elon Musk. But most wealthy people in the United States actually kind of tend to be pretty liberal. And they tend to concentrate around the coasts. And that sort of obscured this other world that exists within finance, within traditional companies like Publix, or Home Depot, or things like this, right? Where plenty of major stockholders are super, super, super right wing. That it was for a long time that these incredibly wealthy conservatives were often kind of free market, sort of socially liberal, fiscally conservatives, or conservatives, right? In that kind of billionaire class. The idea that the billionaires, or some of them, especially the ones that are a little bit less public, would be overtly fascist, is something that harkens back to the 30s, right? It's from a different time. But in some way, it's always been there. It's just something we haven't been able to see, right? If you really go dive into like the history of the John Birch Society, for example, plenty of the funders of the John Birch Society were incredibly wealthy, right? A lot of the funders for like right-wing campaigns in the 1960s were incredibly wealthy. Like that happened, but it was done very quietly. What's happening now is like the Mercer family will fund all kinds of right-wing stuff and not deny it at all or hide it at all or whatever. They'll be very open about what they're doing, right? But some of the other ones are not. And so what we're starting to see, I think a bit, is we're starting to see the actual complexity of some of these funding structures, especially around Bannon. It's not just Peter Thiel, and it's not just the Mercers. And it's not just weirdly, as we figured out this week, at least in part, Jeffrey Epstein. But instead, we're talking about like major shareholders, former executives at companies that made a lot of money, stuff like this. Like these, I mean, not even all billionaires. Like some of these people are millionaires multiple times over. And they're throwing a large amount of their financial reserves into this stuff, which really tells you that unlike political funding structures in the past, where the wealthy were trying to gain influence within the political system and doing that with some level of measure, right? Like not throwing all of their money into politics. That's not what's happening anymore. And it started with people like the Mercers and started with people like Sheldon Adelson, who is dead currently, but was a major funder of right-wing Republicans. They started doing this and being really open about it and throwing a lot of their resources into these things, literally as much as they legally can, or financially sustain. They're not saving their money. They're not doing that with measure. That tells me that these people are actually dedicated. You know, for as much as they might be these kind of people born with silver spoons in their mouths, they're really dedicated to fascism, partly because they are throwing a lot of money that way. Which again, last time the wealthy were willing to throw a ton of their money at political campaigns that were outside of just gaining influence, they were also fascist movements too. And so there's not precedent for this. But I think a lot of Americans, myself included, right, and I think most of us, right, because these networks are pretty hidden, are really starting to understand the depth of the funding structures that hold the right wing up. I think it's difficult for a lot of us to understand what that feels like because we don't have that. You know, we don't have funders like that. We don't have billionaires throwing us money. We do all these things. We build hundreds of mutual aid projects. We run the alt-right off the streets. We do all of this stuff, you know, participate in the uprising and bail literally thousands of people out of jail. We do all these things with no large institutional funders or central organization. The right wing works very differently. And so if you can think of the right wing like an iceberg, sure, we see Steve Bannon, but who's sitting behind that? Well, what's interesting is it's probably also the same people that are sitting behind any number of other really heinous, awful stuff that's happened. Because really, though that funding network might be pretty broad, what you see certain people funding pretty common, similar things, like the Mercers, for example, really hone in on like right-wing propaganda. Like what they're trying to do is they're trying to fund right-wing propaganda, specifically Breitbart, and now a number of other kind of latent journalism projects that haven't really gotten off the ground. And so those people also potentially have some exposure to lawsuits as well. They're now being shown as the reason why these things are allowed to occur at the scale that they're allowed to occur. And that makes them responsible legally to some degree or another. We will see what that ends up meaning, but it very well could mean that for some of these people, some of these very wealthy people who really don't like the fact that all their friends in New York won't talk to them anymore, or none of their family members will talk to them anymore, and they feel really isolated in their big mansions, and then get totally, like, you know, just absolutely shredded in the public for, you know, being a fascist. There's going to be a number of these people that are going to be like, look, I'm done, and just drop out of that funding structure. And if that happens, the right wing could have a lot of problems because, unlike stuff that anarchists do, maintaining things of the right wing is very expensive. Even though they like to portray themselves as a grassroots movement, none of that's possible without billionaires giving them literally millions of dollars a year.
For sure. Reminds me of a Good Charlotte song, Lifestyle of Rich and Famous.
Of all the things I never thought I'd hear about on the show, Good Charlotte references, man. That's
hey.
Real throwback.
When has there been a hit encouraging people to create burglaries at celebrities' houses? You know,
this is true.
It broke a lot of barriers. So let's turn now again. So there's been another kind of argument that people have been talking about that Trump next time around will rely less on Proud Boys in the streets, militia people per se, than he will loyalists within the state launching a coup. And this will kind of lead us into some recent comments made by Bannon, and you've already brought some of this up, but specifically people have said that they are installing or they already have installed people that will basically run the elections next time around. So let's say another situation comes around like 2024, and they could say like, oh, we've had all these things with voter fraud, you know, it doesn't matter what the votes are. We know that the election went to Trump. You know, we're the ones running the election. We're going to call it for Trump. And they would install him. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, first of all, is that possible? And, you know, is that something we're seeing?
Yeah. So let's start with the second question. Yes, we are seeing it. If you really look at this last round of elections that just happened, so many, like, fringy right-wingers ran for like boards of election seats and school board seats and all these other things. Like there was this really heavy push amongst kind of MAGA world and QAnon world to sort of invade local politics, right? And we kind of started to see it around the critical race theory stuff. But that was already a little bit into that process. Like that conversation had already happened, right? Had already very much started. Steve Bannon had already had multiple people on Steve Bannon's war room talking about, you know, taking local office and being able to like run these bureaucracies and things like that, long before any of the school board meeting stuff happened. But as an outcome of that, I mean, you saw tons of right wingers run for office all over the country. I mean, even like where I live, even in really heavily liberal areas, like just outside of the actual formal boundaries of the city. So like entering suburbs, which, you know, entering suburbs for like a kind of lefty Rust Belt city are also actually more left wing than the city is generally, by a little bit at least. You had like QAnon people running for school boards in places like that. They didn't win. Most of those people didn't win. They lost. But the impetus is there. Right? Like, that cat's out of the bag and they're doing this. That's not new, though. I want to be really clear about this. the right wing, the electoral right, unlike the electoral left, really heavily focuses on these sort of easily winnable local seats. And it's actually not, if you're going to do electoralism, it's not a bad strategy. Because they sit there and they go, okay, well, generally people like county treasurers run unopposed. And people like sheriffs and judges and stuff run unopposed a lot of the time. People who are in boards of elections, people who are elected officials in city government, often a lot of those people don't have opposition. And so there are plenty of times where somebody has to not run for re-election or resign or is just kind of unpopular or something like that, where it's really easy for somebody with like no experience and no name recognition to just swoop their way into an office, right? Like most of us that listen to this show, if we really did our research and had any desire to do this, could be doing the same thing, right? That'd be silly for us to do for a lot of reasons. But within an electoral strategy, that does actually function. The right wing's been doing this for decades and decades and decades. Like that's not new. The religious right very specifically did this very publicly. But what's happening now is it's getting organized as a political project. It's not just, hey, everybody run for school boards, and then you get this kind of cumulative cultural effect over time, which is sort of what the religious right was doing, right? Now it's, let's have this very coherent, coordinated, organized strategy. There is a possibility of this being successful superficially, right? I want to say that. Like, it is absolutely possible. I would say not only possible, it will happen that during the midterm elections, some county official somewhere is going to try and throw all the votes in the county out and just declare someone a winner. It's going to happen. And it's going to happen more than once. Okay? I will absolutely 1,000% promise everybody that. I would put money on that. It happened this time. It happened in 2020. Tina Peters, who was an election official in Nevada, stole a voting machine and gave it to, stole the operating system image of a voting machine and gave it to Ron Watkins, of all people. And then it showed up at the Mike Lindell Cyber Symposium. So like, these things have already happened before there was a coordinated strategy to do this. So we're going to see this. Now, that whole strategy sort of exists functionally on a local level because it's not overwhelmingly successful. It is successful, sure, but it is not so successful that everybody cares about it, right? And this is really where this kind of scale shift from local politics to state politics to national politics really matters. When we're talking about a national election, if they were to try to do this, again, keep in mind, conservatives are by far a minority politically in the United States and increasingly becoming so every single day. The United States continues to get more liberal generally, but, more like younger generations are definitely more in kind of the like radical or leftist kind of spectrum a lot of the time. It is not conceivable, as far as I'm concerned, that there would ever be a situation in which Donald Trump would be able to actually steal an election, because there's two things sitting in the way of that they can't control through this local election strategy or through this sort of invading the bureaucracy strategy that they're sort of trying to scale up right now. The first is the courts. I think a lot of people forget or don't know that of the 40-something lawsuits that were filed around the election by the Trump campaign, of which they lost every single one except got a partial victory judgment on a really superficial point in one in Wisconsin, but generally lost everything else. I think in something like half those cases, the judges in those cases were appointed by Donald Trump, right? Like these are people who are relatively new federal judges, a lot of them. And that's pretty common in lower federal courts where, people don't actually stay in that position for their whole lives. They kind of do it for a little bit and, go back to their law practice or something. There's a lot of churn in lower level federal courts. And so, I mean, Trump appointed like hundreds of federal judges. I forget the number, but it was literally when he says, I appointed a record number of judges, that is the one thing he is not lying about. That is absolutely true. He completely did that. Because that's about most of what they spent their time doing, was just appointing judges to low-level federal courts. Now, part of that early on felt like Trump pandering to the right wing, specifically around questions of abortion, right? And we're seeing the effects of that now. But towards the end of the administration, that was an intentional effort to sort of skew the terrain. And it failed horrendously. And it failed because of the same judges he was appointing. When you get into the courts, there's a really different mentality there. You know, I don't know how many of you know lawyers. I think everyone that listens to this show should probably know at least one attorney. I have a lot of friends that are lawyers, right? Everyone should know lawyers. But if you really talk to lawyers a lot, there is a certain decorum or set of expectations or set of sort of intellectual norms that exist within the court system that really curtail pretty heavily notions of using your position for political gain, right? For trying to advance a political position, largely because you just get overruled by the next court up from you. So there's not really much of a point in doing that until you're on the Supreme Court, which, again, we're seeing the effects of that right now. But when you're in these lower courts that make these kinds of decisions, there tends to still be a notion of principle involved, right? That you're not judging the case based on your political preferences. You're judging the case based on case law. And it doesn't really actually matter how much you might agree with a plaintiff in a case. If they're not on the side of the common interpretation of the law, they lose. And judges in the federal system very specifically are expected to uphold that, and do, largely. And so this whole strategy ignores the fact that there's a court system that exists that has the ability to invalidate all of this. And will. There's no doubt in my mind that it will. If that fails, right? If that fails, then there's the second big problem they have, which is us. Could you imagine what would happen in the United States if Donald Trump ran in 2024 and then used a bunch of states' attorney generals that he, kind of endorsed and funded and got put into office and then used that to steal an election? Do you have any idea what the social response to that would be? It'd be catastrophic. Catastrophic. It would make the uprising last year look like, amateur hour. It would be catastrophic. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. I mean, we talked about this right after the election. Hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. not leaving until something very, very, very profoundly changes. You're talking about cities, whole cities going on strike, right? Shutting the economy down, and Americans will do that. Absolutely would do that in that situation. Not even because it's Donald Trump. Got to keep in mind how many, specifically liberals, labor under the delusions of American so-called democracy, right? They labor under these sort of expectations that political norms are going to be upheld, and that those political norms are the political identity of the whole country. That is a super common position amongst Americans. All of that is under threat in a situation in which there is a conscious attempt to invade state offices organized in public, funded publicly by organizations that have to report their financial documents in order to put people in a position to steal an election. There's no plausible deniability there. It's really obvious what you're doing. And so, sure, they'll do it. They'll do it. They'll even be successful in some places for the time being. But when we start to crest into things that actually matter, when we're starting to talk about people's safety, we're starting to talk about people's sense of security, and we're starting to talk about the world people want to live in. Historically, especially in the modern era, until the last 20 years or so, there was a nice solid period of 30 years, 25, 30 years, where Americans were pretty timid about those kinds of things. You had explosions like the LA riots in 94, or 92 and things like that, right? Million Man March was in 94. But those were sort of very momentary things. It was really after Seattle you started seeing concerted resistance in the United States again. And that was very generational. And so as those generations that have been in the streets for the last 20 years become predominant, the chances that you're going to be able to just walk away with an election like that are less and less and less likely. We also have to keep in mind that the way that you would have to stop people from preventing you from doing that would be calling the military out and shooting people. And there's plenty of really valid arguments as to why that won't happen. Not just because of military norms, but because of soldiers. I mean, we saw it last year. There were National Guard troops all over the country that refused to fire tear gas, refused to fire rubber bullets, refused orders, even put down their weapons at various points, right? And that was, early stages of the uprising. If someone tries to steal an election, that will be a lot more common. A lot of those people in the armed forces really do believe the bullshit. Like, they really do believe that they are fighting to preserve American democracy from, foreign enemies, blah, blah, blah. If that enemy becomes domestic, that's also part of the military oath, right? You're protecting the country from enemies, foreign and domestic. And a lot of people in the armed forces take that really seriously. And they won't view us necessarily as that enemy. It would tear the country apart completely. There'd be very little left of the American political system at the end of that process.
Well, that kind of brings us to our last question, which is like, okay, so then you have people like Steve Bannon, who has a massive audience. I mean, as you're about, there's 10 million people that listen to his podcast?
Every single day. Every single day. He's got more listeners than Alex Jones. Yeah.
So, I mean, what does it mean that he's talking about literally putting the heads of FBI agents on pikes?
Yep.
He's talking with Matt Gaetz about sending in shock troops to ensure that Trump is, president. I mean, what do we make of that? I mean, you talk about it'll tear the country apart, but I mean, somebody's listening to that and it's having a resonance.
Yeah, it is. It's having a lot of resonance amongst, even 10 million people, still a sizable but small faction in American politics, right? Keep in mind, both Trump and Joe Biden got over 70 million votes during the last election, right? And those were people that turned up to vote. There's a lot of people that didn't still. And so, sure, 10 million people listen to Steve Bannon's War Room. Most of those people are not in a position to do anything about this. They don't have the education. They don't have the connections. They don't have the funding. They don't have the position or the will to sideline their whole life and get a job in government bureaucracy. I mean, this is part of the issue with this whole strategy. He is really what he's asking people to do is put their whole lives aside. You don't just run for office. If you win that office, you have to quit your job and stuff, right? He's literally asking people to sideline their whole lives. Now, anyone that's ever been involved in organizing work will tell you this. People get really, really, really passionate about politics until it starts to cost them something. And then a lot of people will back down, especially if that cost is relatively severe, like your reputation, which if you run as a right-wing candidate in a lot of the country, that reputation is pretty much shot forever. You will have a hard time getting jobs. You'll have a hard time having friends, right? In large swaths of the United States, even parts of the country that are really conservative, it becomes a difficulty for you. And again, you have to quit your job and stuff. There's a lot of people that listen to Steve Bannon's War Room. There are not a lot of people that are willing to do that. We saw some of those people turn up on January 6th, right? There are people that were like, we're going to die for Donald Trump, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't even the majority faction of people there. And so there's this kind of problem that someone like Steve Bannon has, where he has a ton of reach. And the strategy on a very formal level, if you're only really thinking on the level of statecraft, makes sense. But the problem is that the rest of the world exists. Not just other Americans, right, who will fight in the streets about something like this, but the whole rest of the world too. And the reality is that if Steve Bannon is successful, the United States becomes a pariah globally. The idea of American global hegemony collapses. America ceases to be a global economic power in the way that it is today. We lose all of our alliances with Europe. Everything falls apart, and we end up becoming a part of that constellation of countries like Turkey and Hungary and Russia that are very overtly authoritarian and pretty much ostracized from the whole rest of the world. That, again, collapses the American political system and the economy, right? And so, again, this is one of these... Steve Bannon is a very smart person, right? I want to be very clear about that. The reason he is dangerous is he's smart, and he's smart in a number of different ways. One of those is he reads a lot. I mean, he is an incredibly well-read person. I'm a person who's studied philosophy, and as a part of that, was studying, fascist philosophy, trying to understand fascism. And as a part of that, you have to read people like Julius Evola. You have to read Alexander Dugin. You have to really, read esoteric fascists, which almost nobody reads, but Steve Bannon does. Steve Bannon cited Julius Evola at a speech he gave in Rome, right? Steve Bannon has talked about reading Alexander Dugin and corresponding with him. This is not a guy who views himself as a political operative. He views himself as a political theorist and a public intellectual. Right? And he is very intelligent. So it makes him dangerous. But he's also incredibly astute at communicating with people. So he himself is kind of a mess, right? You look at Steve Bannon and he's kind of a mess. He looks like he hasn't slept in 4 or 5 days. He's, for some reason, is wearing 3 different shirts that all have collars. I never really understood that. He looks like he probably hasn't showered or eaten in the last 24 hours. He doesn't look like a clean-cut political operative, right? But what he does incredibly, incredibly well is he takes these really complicated ideas that he has, because Steve Bannon's understanding of the world is relatively complex. His understanding of politics is complex. His understanding of strategy is relatively complex. He takes all of that and he simplifies it into really easy to remember terms. So, for example, he's not going to sit there and talk about how really what needs to happen is that this class of enlightened people with these very specific intellectual characteristics need to sort of take control of the modern world and sort of return it back to tradition. He's not going to talk about that because that sounds like Julius Evola. What he's going to say is we need to take control of the administrative state. Now, that term is really weird because all states are administrative states, right? It doesn't mean anything. It's a meaningless word. It's a meaningless term, but it sounds really smart and it denotes something very specific. And so the listeners to Steve Bannon's War Room tend to online view themselves as really well informed because they listen to Steve Bannon and they use terms like administrative state and so on, even though they don't know what the hell that means. And they feel a part of the discourse as a result. He's incredibly good at that. And that's fine if you're trying to make money running a podcast. Totally do that. That's even fine if you're trying to gain a position in the White House. You can absolutely do that. Where that fails, though, is that you end up existing in this world in which everything that you see increasingly revolves around the world that you live in, right? He's no longer really existing in the world with the rest of us. He's sort of existing almost entirely within this right-wing bubble. And within that right-wing bubble, this strategy makes total sense. In fact, this strategy would be considered moderate by a lot of other people within that right-wing bubble, right? It's reasonable, right? It's the middle ground. It's not, overthrowing the government by storming the Capitol, blah, 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 and murdering all the politicians. It's a lot more moderate than that on the surface. But outside of that world, though, there's this problem. And, I don't really want to focus on the courts here. I don't even really want to focus on the fact that people are not going to give their whole lives up for this. They're just not. They're too demoralized at this point, and I don't think many people really see this being a viable strategy, even though they're excited about it and repeat it. It's not viable enough to give their lives up for. But most importantly, though, again, at the end of the day, all of the things that they're trying to do eventually collide with us, right? Now, unlike them, a lot of us have been out in the streets for over a decade. We're really well organized. We're really well networked. And we don't need centralized organizations to be able to fight, right? We just need phones or encrypted communications and some way of getting in touch with people. We don't even need organizations to do it, right? And if you look really at what happened last year, sure, there were plenty of organizations around. That was not the driving force of what was going on. The driving force was coming organically. And that's really the future of resistance. The future of resistance is not build the mass organization. The future of resistance is not even what I would argue is kind of the approach I traditionally take, like a more insurrectionist approach, which is like this kind of, organization for temporary utility and sort of this maximization of autonomy within that structure, right? So on, so on. It's a lot more nebulous than that today. And they would have to contend with that. That's not a fight they're going to win. If they were to think about these things realistically, and, the election season should definitely make this very clear to everyone, but a lot of the people in that world exist within a fantasy. Like, they really did think that they were going to be able to overturn the election. There was absolutely no possibility of that ever happening in a million years, and they were very convinced that it was. Millions of people were very convinced that that was going to happen, right? So very clearly, they exist in these weird bubbles, and those bubbles are getting stronger and more isolated every day as they leave Facebook and Twitter and go to weird, fringy social media networks and stuff like that, where they're only really talking to each other. And within that world, I don't want to absolve us of similar dynamics, right? Because if you're in the middle of activist campaigns, by activist campaigns, I specifically do not mean attempts at actually changing the way we live. When I mean activist campaigns, I mean political actions based on expressing outrage discursively, right? In that world, there's plenty of fictions too, right? The anti-war movement was motivated by this delusion that if you got hundreds of thousands of people in one place, you didn't have to actually stay and take the Capitol over to end the war. All you had to do was get CNN to cover it, and then the politicians would see the light, and they would have their hearts opened from some global meditation circle that happened, and the war was going to end magically, right? That is just as much of a fiction. The difference here is that this is a strategy that in a bubble, in a world where there's no resistance, could work. It really, really could, right? But that's not the world that we live in, right? We don't live in a world that the court system just rolls over and just decides to do whatever some person they agree with says. That's not the history of the court system in the United States. And it's definitely not a place where after everything that's happened over the course of the last year, do I think that there's any chance in hell that they would be able to pull something like this off without resistance that would be so catastrophic it would collapse the entire American state. I don't think that there's any chance in hell that that happens, right? I think often Americans reduce politics to what's going on within statecraft, right? We think about things on the level of policy. We think about things on the level of governance, governmentality. The point in which power is taken that way is the point in which the injunction to become ungovernable becomes the standard operating procedure of every single person in the streets. We can already see what happens when hundreds of thousands of us get out there all across the country, right? We can run the cops completely off the street and a whole bunch of National Guard units and really give the state a run for its money. And a lot of the people that were in the streets were relatively new to street actions last year, right? But the networks that exist to support those things, the logistics that are there, the communications networks that built up last year, the communications networks that built between those of us that have been around a while and people that came into things last year. Those things are still very present. Those do not go away. And those are capable of preventing something like this from happening. Not only preventing something like this from happening, those sort of dynamics, those movements, those networks are strong enough. If people are willing to stand firm in the streets, are strong enough to not only prevent a seizure of power, they're strong enough to keep the fight going after that and change everything about the way we live so it never happens again. That's the risk that they're really taking. The risk that the Bannonists are taking at this point is that they are willing to risk the future of the U.S. political system in the service of this strategy. Now, for Steve Bannon, that's not a problem. Steve Bannon has no adherence to the American political system. He does not care. He only cares about winning. The problem with him is that he won't. For everybody else that becomes a part of that, when they lose, power will be denied to them forever. Power might be denied to every politician after that point. That is not something that America comes back from. And so in the name of patriotism, they'll destroy the entire country. That is absolutely the direction that they're heading in. So it's not that it won't be attempted. It will. What scale that attempt happens on really depends really heavily on how many people actually take this call up and actually sideline their lives to do this. It's not going to be many. What will happen is that people will invalidate election results. That'll get overturned by the courts. And then the right wing will use that as ammunition to be able to say, oh, well, the courts are siding with the communists and we really need, and it will become part of the trajectory forward. That's very likely potentially to lead to social conflict, which they won't win. But again, if the right wing is able to survive that failure, they will be able to use what comes out of that failure in the future to try and grow again. And that's really the big risk. And so we're not talking about a reality in which this is successful, I don't think. We might be talking about a reality in which we are the reason it's not. And that's the thing that we have to be really looking out for.
That could be an even more violent situation than Trump just putting a lot of loyalists into office.
It will be. Because unlike what happened at the beginning of the uprising last year, or even during the election where police were trying to maintain this, again, myth of neutrality, they're not even doing that anymore. Right? The cops have taken a side. And that's become very, very, very obvious. And that means that next time around, they're going to fight us harder than they did the first time. Because next time around, it's not about, let's get these people off the street to preserve public order. Now it's about, let's destroy our opposition.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.